I'm Janie Cohen. I direct the Fleming Museum, and we're thrilled to have you all with us tonight for Jeffry Diefendorf's talk on Samuel Bach. And if any of you have not seen the exhibition that's right across the Marble Court, please take an opportunity to do that. It's open through May 22nd, is that right? Great, so you have some time. I want to make one acknowledgement before I introduce Jeffrey, which is to thank the UVM Center for Holocaust Studies for bringing Samuel Bach work to our attention. We are really thrilled to be able to present it here in Vermont to broad audiences, and it's just been a thrill so far, and the response has been really, really moving. We'd also like to thank the Center for their support of the show and of Jeff's talk tonight. So, thank you. And then before I forget, please turn off your cell phones. Thank you very much. Jeffry Diefendorf received his PhD in history from UC Berkeley, and he serves as professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. He's been an active scholar in several fields, including modern German history, European and American urban history, and Holocaust history. He's the author or editor of 9 books, including The Rebuilding of Europe's Bombed Cities, 1990 publication by St. Martin's Press, In the Wake of War, The Reconstruction of German Cities After World War II, 1993, Oxford University Press, Lessons and Legacies 6, a compilation of essays, New Currents in Holocaust Research, 2004, Northwestern University Press, and Transnationalism and the German City, which is published by Palgrave in 2014, and this is just a few. He's also published over 50 journal articles and book chapters. He's received fellowships from NEH, NSF, Woodrow Wilson Center, and Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. In 2004, he received the UNH Distinguished Professor Award, and in 2007, received the Pamela Schulman Professorship in European and Holocaust Studies in recognition of his having been responsible for raising endowment to fund Holocaust studies at UNH and providing oversight of Holocaust-related programming there as well. He is personal friends with the artist, with Sam Bach. And Jeffrey has spoken widely on Sam's work, as well as having organized a major exhibition in 2006 at the University of New Hampshire. So we are thrilled to have you with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Durer.
Thank you very much. And I really want to thank the staff here at the Fleming Museum of Art, both for inviting me, but also staging an exhibition of Sam Bach's work. And I also want to thank Alan Steinweiss, the director of the UVM Leonard Miller Center for Holocaust Studies, for the invitation also to speak here. Now, my goal tonight is to talk about the work of Samuel Bach. He's a Holocaust survivor and one of the most important artists to use some of his work to confront the Holocaust. Bach himself is a wonderfully articulate man, whether talking about his life, his art, or the art of others. It's also worth noting that there are numerous publications about Sam Bach's work, some being books or gallery exhibition catalogs sponsored by the Pucker Gallery. A notable devoted author is a famous Holocaust testimony scholar and analyst, Lawrence Langer. And there's an important book by Samuel Bach, Painted in Words, a memoir, published by Indiana University Press, should you ever want to read that. There are also several videos that have been made about him. Here is a photograph of Sam in his home. And there's the title of the memoir on the bottom, the video, Sam Bak, Painter of Questions. That's available at the National Center for Jewish Film. It's a DVD one can get from Brandeis. Now, first I want to explain how I came to this subject. I'm a historian of modern Germany, and I teach about the Holocaust, but I am not an art historian, an art critic, or museum curator, nor am I an artist myself, somebody capable of analyzing the fine points of technique. I mention these limitations on my own knowledge because they help explain how I approach these works of art. Now, in the spring of 2005, the director of the University of New Hampshire Art Museum said that she knew I taught courses on the Holocaust and asked if I was interested supporting a small exhibit, maybe 8 to 10 pieces, by an artist named Samuel Bak. She wanted to know if I knew him. I didn't. And this led to a rather large exhibit for which I became kind of co-curator of 47 works, including several monumental pieces that were then displayed in the spring of 2006. And here's just one photograph of the UNH Museum and containing some of the works that were on display there. In preparation for the exhibit and auxiliary events, I studied books and exhibit catalogs, several video documentaries, and looked at the works on display and also in the storage room down at the Pucker Gallery in Boston, which represents the work and sells the work of Samuel Bak, and provided the works that are over, most of them that are over there on display. In case I've also been able to get to know the owner of that gallery, but also Sam Bak and his wife. And I've gotten to know him so well, that's why I call him Sam rather than just Samuel. If any of you are down in Boston, there's going to be an exhibit of some of his new work that's going to open a week from this coming Saturday. And so if you find, you'll be there for a couple of months, if you're there, you can, that's where it is on Newbury Street in the heart of Boston. Now, I'm not just the only enthusiast for the work by Sam Bak. There have been solo exhibitions in more than 30 galleries in places other than the Pucker Gallery in Boston. And these include galleries in Rome, London, Brussels, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Munich and Berlin, Frankfurt, Zurich and Basel, Switzerland, Paris, even one recently in South Africa. In addition, one high point of the Pucker Gallery exhibitions is that Sam attends the opening, and he's always willing to talk to visitors who are looking at his paintings. Having attended numerous opening exhibit celebrations myself, I have noticed that even when visitors inspect paintings that reflect some elements of the Holocaust, they are not upset by what he produces. Addition, I should say, there have been some 20 museum exhibitions abroad in museums all over Europe, Lithuania, South Africa. In Germany, this included an exhibition in the German National Museum in Nuremberg, which is where Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party had its regular events. And that museum also added one of Sam's paintings to its collection. And Sam is rather proud of the fact that as a Holocaust survivor, that he's represented in that location. In Lithuania, which is where he was born, there's still an effort to establish a special museum devoted to Samuel Bak's work. And there have been many museums in our country that have also staged Bak exhibitions. Many of them are college museums. It's also worth noting that the Holocaust Museum in Houston, Texas, has just added a wing to that museum to have a permanent exhibition of a large collection of Sam Bak's work, not just a temporary, occasional one. And in fact, this spring there was a big exhibition, or is an exhibition of Sam Bak's work at the Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. I also want to mention to you, many of you I hope have heard of Facing History. That's an organization in Boston which particularly produces material for people who teach in K-12 schools or colleges about how to teach about the Holocaust, but also, say, racism in the United States and things of that sort. And I want to mention that Facing History now has a big collection of paintings of Sam Bak that are available for special exhibitions at schools or other places that want to address his work and the Holocaust. So any of you that say are students and think maybe someday you're going to be a teacher, you could keep that in mind if you're somewhere, because that may be a way of staging an exhibition. Now, one thing that makes these vast exhibitions and so possible is that Sam Bak has produced probably more than 2,000 artworks. And today, as of today, he's almost 83 years old, and he's still producing over 100 paintings every year. And he's produced so many wonderful paintings. You know, I can't provide slides of 2,000 images this evening, but it's really quite extraordinary. And I also want to note that Sam has received now 3 honorary degrees, doctorate degrees. The first one from the University of New Hampshire, 2012, also Seton Hill University and the Massachusetts College of Art and Design last year. Now let me say a few things about his life. He was born in 1933 in Vilna, which was then part of Poland and is now the capital of Lithuania. It was a city of around 195,000 people before World War II, of which about 55,000 were Jews. And this is typical of the largest cities in Poland in that area with a big Jewish population. Sam's community there, he said, was his family was relatively secular, kind of an assimilated Jewish family. His father was a dentist, his family was comfortably well off, and of course that ended in the war. When Germany invaded Poland, part of the agreement between Hitler and Stalin was that the Soviet Union could seize the eastern half of Poland, and that included Vilna. But 2 years later, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union and quickly conquered the Baltic states. Sam Bak obviously survived, along with his mother, although his father and grandparents and other relatives were murdered. Initially, they were forced from their home and had to abandon their possessions. And the Bak family was put in a ghetto in Vilna. But they soon actually, this family escaped and hid in a Benedictine convent in Vilna. They got access to that because they had a relative that had converted to Catholicism and had married a nephew of the Archbishop of Warsaw. But a few months later, the Germans nearly found them there, and at the risk of being discovered and being shot, that grew, and because food was growing scarce, they left the convent. They happened to see a passing column of Jewish laborers move back to the ghetto where they thought they could go and survive and get food. As was common in many of the ghettos that the Germans really created, the Jews there took steps to maintain their culture. And not only, say, including having schools and things, but they wanted to have an art exhibition. And those that organized it included several artworks by this teenager, Sam Bak. Evidently, some of the adult artists were rather frustrated that not enough of their work was being displayed, and they put up a bunch of works by this kid. Well, anyway, the Germans soon moved the Baks all to a labor camp where his father worked, and his mother managed to escape again, having heard from a Nazi officer about the possible upcoming closure of the camp and all, and that its Jews might be deported and killed. Sam's father, knowing this, smuggled his son out of this labor camp, putting him in a burlap sack and kind of tossing him over the wall. But not being hurt, he managed to get down with his mother and go back into that convent, which by then had been closed by the Nazis, and it was in use as a storage facility for masses of Jewish books and archives that the Nazis were confiscating in that area, and some were Jews hid behind that. But, as I said, the Nazis had murdered Sam, then murdered his father, his grandparents, and they in fact killed many of them in a nearby forest called Ponari. And in many of the paintings that he has done, there are broken trees, which is one of his sense of that site where his family and other Jews there were murdered. about 95% of the Jews of Vilna were killed. Sam and his mother are among 2,500 Jewish survivors. And Sam said in a recent talk that his childhood in Vilna was like a paradise, but when the Nazis seized it, it became a, quote, planet of unspeakable crime, horror, and fear. And for most survivors, grief, trauma, and shame kept them silent. As a mature artist, his view of the world is not just the place of the Holocaust, but also it's regularly what he feels it's a site of hope, of looking for a better future. There's a hope image across the hall over here. And he constantly does things, as you can see here, and sometimes like on the top where there's the word hope. But he also does paintings with hope like this, where you have to notice that there are letters at some other place in the image. Well, after Vilna was liberated by the Soviets when they were defeating the Nazis, and the war then ended, Sam Bak and his mother, as pre-war Polish citizens, left Vilna. Why? Because they were afraid and aware that local Poles are also anti-Semitic, and they were afraid that even the defeat of the Nazis might not end problems in that area. So they were allowed to go to Poland, but they didn't stay there. They went on first to Berlin, then Hanover, then Frankfurt, and Munich, and then into a displaced persons camp in Landsberg, Germany, down near Munich. And this was a former concentration camp that was really heavily filled after 1945 for several years with Jews who had come from even parts of the Soviet Union and Baltic states. While Sam was there, and he's still just a teenager, he took painting lessons there and in Munich, and he produced paintings, some of which have been preserved. When I once visited the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, I saw a film made by U.S. forces that guarded that displaced persons camp in Landsberg. And part of that film showed Jews there, but also at one moment it showed a photo of a teenage artist doing a drawing of a kid. I thought it looked like Sam Bak, and he later confirmed to me, yes, that was him. He was surprised once when he went to that museum to see a film of himself in a corner there. Well, in 1948, his mother married again, and they left for Israel. And it's there he studied more art. He lived there until he had completed his military service in the mid-1950s. He then went to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. And between 1959 and 93, he lived in Paris, in Rome, in New York City, in Israel again, and in Switzerland. Among the things he did in Israel, he said, was to design settings for some theater performances. But unfortunately, evidently, there are no records of that have survived to really add a documentary to his early work. Well, one result of his residence in so many countries is this. Samuel Bak is incredibly multilingual. He's able to read and speak English, Hebrew, French, Italian, German, and Polish. He thinks that's perfectly normal, but I really don't know very many people that can just be comfortably with 5 or 6 different languages. In any case, after years there in Europe and Israel, he settled in Weston, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. He did in 1993. It's where he and his wife live today. He's a U.S. citizen. Why there? He had met Bernie Pucker, who had offered to become his regular dealer. And so Sam and his now Swiss wife decided to move to Boston, or to a suburb. They couldn't find a suitable home and place for a studio in the heart of Boston. That's why they ended up in a suburb just outside of Route 128. Well, at the crowded opening of one exhibition at the Pucker Gallery, I stood next to a couple who were humming with awe while gazing at a painting. They were doing Well, I nearly used that happy noise for the title of today's talk, but I feared that might be a little too obscure. But rather than humming, M's. The letter M is sometimes a useful tool to analyze his work. That one term starts with an M is using his art to elaborate on memory, his own personal memory of what happened to his family and community, but the larger memory of European Jewry. Because of his tragic experience, and that's part of his own work, his paintings often contain an element of metaphors, images that he does that stand for other kinds of things, that is useful seeing the iconography of what he does. That, for instance, taking the Star of David or damaged trees or smoked chimneys or pears or things, you can see examples of this over in the exhibition. For instance, the way the word Auschwitz is often used to stand for the entire Holocaust, Bak uses the image of a ghetto boy to stand for the lost childhood of Jewish children killed by the Nazis. In the same way that partly dismembered human figures stand for the destruction of human life. And broken household crockery or children's toys reflect what had happened under the Nazis. And another thing one can think of is this, that images, recognizable images and symbols are transformed into something else. And that will show up in images of the little boy in the Warsaw Ghetto when they revolted and then it was transformed by the Nazis, and he uses that image as a way of displaying himself and friends and other victims. At times he's a real participant in a kind of modernist work, but also surrealism. Some of his paintings are small, but many are monumental in size, and his perspectives, I think, are often monumental as he comments on Western values from, say, Genesis to the Renaissance to the present. Now, one of the large ways to approach Sam's work is the rubric of representing the Holocaust. I think it's significant that if one looks at the Britannica Encyclopedia website for the Holocaust, an entry on the Holocaust starts with one of Sam's paintings. Smoke. And you see 5 by 6 feet, that's a big piece. And there is a detail of the top sight. Now, when one moves down to the discussion of artistic representation, not only is Sam Bak the first painter mentioned, but there's another of his major works, Nuremberg Elegy, starts in this entry. That, again, you can see over in the exhibit here, an example, and he did many versions of this one. And here's a different version of that, Measure of Time. And you can see next to, there's a photograph over there showing the little image by Albrecht Durer, German Renaissance artist who did this, which Sam Bak has developed himself and taken. Now, it might be odd to you, but in fact, there has been a debate going on ever since the early post-war years about whether anyone can or should represent the horrible events of the Holocaust in artistic form. Is that legitimate to do? This debate was particularly sparked by the critic Theodor Adorno, whose post-war famous admonition was that to write poetry after Auschwitz was barbaric. one shouldn't, in other words, an artist, portray this. Others have noticed that the barbarism of Auschwitz completely transcends rational understanding and exceeds the ability of literary or artistic form to portray what it was really like. True realism in artistic representation of the Holocaust, in other words, they say, is not possible. Hence, the best the Holocaust can be represented is only indirectly, as suggested by Aaron Appelfeld's aphorism that, quote, one does not look directly into the sun. In other words, artists or anybody can't really do that. But other scholars have asked whether even the indirect representation becomes a substitute for the reality of the Holocaust, providing both distance and distortion and portraying a single experience, freezing a moment or interpretation. Does a work of art reduce, even in some cases, trivialize the magnitude and horror of the Holocaust? Still, other scholars have expressed concern that imagery representing the violence and atrocity of the Holocaust borders on the pornography of violence, such as clandestine snuff films of actual killings or the splatter films full of blood and gore produced for a mass market. Well, in spite of these concerns, criticisms, the Holocaust has obviously been portrayed in all art forms: poetry, literature, film of all kinds, fictional documentaries, docudramas, music, paintings, sculpture, and architecture. Survivor testimonies, history books, and museum exhibitions are also a form of representation. It's not possible for anyone to present each and every event in every detail. So survivors, historians, teachers, and artists all must select events, find a medium and vocabulary, and represent parts of the Holocaust in a form that necessarily includes not just facts, but interpretation. Consequently, scholars have argued not just about how the Holocaust is represented, but what is being represented, whether these representations are appropriate, accurate, or ethical, and so on. The debate has included not only representative works, the intentions of the artist, but also the ways in which those seeing, reading, or hearing the work respond and why. Postmodernist theory contends that viewers experience art as a text, necessarily understanding it in their own terms. Reactions, interpretations, and meanings are shaped by the viewer's own experience and language, whatever the supposed intent of the artist. Now, I don't want to go any further into this rarefied academic debate, but it's important to know that it is there, and it can be relevant for some people in approaching the works of Sam Bak as an artist portraying elements of the Holocaust. Well, let me offer one example. Back in 2006, when the University of New Hampshire did have that exhibit of his paintings, I told my students they were to select one painting and write a paper about it. And I encouraged them to think about the symbols that were in it, the nature of the composition, the kind of colors, the references that were being made to the Holocaust or some part of Sam's own life. And one small regret that I had there is this. A young woman told me that she had in fact never in her life visited an art museum or seen an art exhibition. And she was so mesmerized by Sam's work, and particularly by one particular painting, that she spent several hours sitting on the floor looking at it, at sometimes crying, and dealing with her reactions. And this is the one that was traumatizing for her. And what you see here, teddy bears. One of the things that happened to Sam Bak is that when his family was forced to leave their home by the Nazis, he wanted to take a teddy bear with him to the ghetto or wherever they were going to be. His mother said, "Oh no, that's ridiculous, you carry some clothing or something like that." And so he had to discard it. And he's done lots of paintings of teddy bears that were abandoned or wounded or maltreated. And so here we have a teddy bear, and there's also bullet holes up on that sign of the sky. And that's the one that my student sat in front of, and the directors of the art museums wanted to know why I didn't come and help her. I didn't know she was there, traumatized by looking at this work by Sam Bak. So for some people, his work can be really traumatic. You know, I have to ask, was this what Sam intended when he did this painting, to shock people into tears? And was I proper in doing that assignment? Sam doesn't really intend this. I probably should have provided more information to her and guided her rather than just sending her off on her own. And there were things she hadn't noticed, the bullet holes, and you will see in many of Sam's paintings here and other places that he shows some of the, suggesting the damage that the Nazis had done, portraying it in a, say, a canvas or a torn canvas. He also shows broken walls and all kinds of things like that. And you know, some of this is biographical in terms of what he knew had happened in Vilna and saw in Vilna, and it's also part of what he knew happened in many other places. Well, Skies Are the Limit, that's a title. One has to look at the titles of his works. Does this mean it's the loss of childhood dreams? Anyway, it's the kind of thing that scholars about the Holocaust need to contemplate when they see Sam's work. Well, with this, let me turn away from just the larger arguments and framework of Holocaust art to Sam in particular and the kinds of things that he does. Here's another photograph of Sam. As a young painter after the war, he worked in various styles, including some abstract expressionism, before turning to a kind of surrealism or bits of cubism. Here's a couple of examples of some of his earlier work. One, Fear, in 1946. He did this at the age of 13. If any of you here in the audience are artists, you might think of what you did at the age of 13. It's people who are afraid as they were being rounded up, perhaps, or put in a ghetto or something like that. Or Under the Wings of Sorrow. This is perhaps a bit part kind of expressionism, slightly abstract expressionism. And his work covers all kinds of different styles, not his whole life doing one particular form of thing. In a recent interview, he said that, quote, "In my canvases, I use the techniques of Renaissance painting with which I render cubist perceptions of familiar realities. With the same technique, I evoke biblical metaphors of Jewish icons and collective allegories." He said that. And his work often combines realism and surrealism. He also notes that some paintings combine visions of healthy and lovely landscapes with elements of ruins. I have several times been lucky to go with him to museum exhibitions in Boston and in Portland, Maine. Some subjects have been old, some are modern. An old one like the very recent Boston exhibition focused particularly on work by Rembrandt and Vermeer. And it's fascinating to be with Sam and hear him explain just exactly how old masters worked to complete a piece. When, at what stage they put on glazes on top of the oils, how they changed their colors when they decided to use a different kind of brush or something like that. These are things that I don't know when I see a work of art, couldn't possibly do, but it's fun to hear him analyze, say, Renaissance era works. Sam does really pay homage to the Renaissance masters, and some of his paintings have references to, say, for instance, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, and there are those in addition to references to damaged villages or buildings. Something he does not do is just try to paint like death camps like Auschwitz, or the masses of people who have been gassed or murdered in that sense. That he tends not to do. And one thing that's important there is he believes that Nazi crimes, including the Holocaust, threaten not only Judaism, but important elements of European culture. Well, by the 1970s, he was developing the distinctive artistic vocabulary, reworking various themes and symbols, and using a particular range of colors that he continues to use today. He has been and continues to be exceptionally prolific, producing work mostly in oil, but also drawings, watercolors, gouaches. The size of pictures range from fairly small, say a square foot, to monumental, 5 by 6 feet, and a few are even bigger than that. And it's interesting, too, that he does not often follow the traditional work pattern that many artists evidently first do a bunch of drawings about what the subject of a painting should be, and then they use that to produce the painting. Moving on to, say, oil and canvas, often Sam does his oil paintings first, and after it's done, then he evidently sometimes takes out paper and does drawings of his oil painting in different forms. And so if you ever see another exhibition and you see some drawings, you know, many of these didn't happen before he did a big oil painting, they did afterwards. And many of his paintings are parts of series, like the Nuremberg Elegy that I showed you a few minutes ago, based on Albrecht Durer's Melancholy Angel from 1514. He did a lot of large versions of this, and starting in 1980, but even in 2007, he produced another more 20 paintings based upon that particular image, and were exhibited in a show entitled Remembering Angels. He's produced lots of works on landscapes, another series based on his return to Vilna, where he went back for the first time in 2001, thinking about how the city had been when he was a kid and what it's like now. He's also used stories from Genesis. He did a series of paintings using chess as a metaphor for life and war and other kinds of themes. There's a chess painting in the exhibit here. And he's also done a series entitled Still Life, you know, and that's a kind of phrase that lots of artists have used, you know, often that's if they're just, say, painting a bowl of fruit or flowers or something, it's a still life. Well, these are some that Sam has produced in a series called Still Life. And these are images of a damaged world. Though when stills for him still life, he often is demonstrating that even in a damaged world, there are still livers or people living or elements of life. After this, he completed a new series entitled Icon of Loss, in which he reworked the iconic photo of a little boy being rounded up after the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, and I'll return to this in a few moments. And this is the way he works, and has for quite a number of years, that he comes up with a particular theme and will spend a year producing a whole series, sometimes well over 100 paintings, on a particular theme, like chess or icons or whatever. That's how he tends to function. And as I said, he does not attempt to present the worst elements of dimensions of the Holocaust directly. He doesn't really produce the brutality, say, of concentration camps or torture or that kind of thing, of people being, images of people being murdered. A lot of his paintings contain references to the little boy who was photographed in Warsaw. And he does this because he thinks in many ways it resembles not only himself, the little boy survived, but also his best friend is a little boy in Vilna named Samek. And so that can be a reference both not only to the Holocaust, but Jewish civilization. And elements of his own life and something much bigger. And as I said, he does manipulate often the images from the work of other famous painters like Michelangelo or Durer. He did a whole series on Adam and Eve being banished from the Eden. That was another one that he did. There's another still life. It's still, but it's not just a bowl of fruit or flowers. It's a still life with damage. And here's some that he did, like the one on the far side over there, Rembrandt's Angel. He took that image to manipulate and so on. He enjoys reworking the Renaissance era. And here again, and this is what you can see over there, this is the piece by Albrecht Durer, a very famous one. And here is the way that Sam Bak has reworked that particular image from the Renaissance. And he's done a whole variety of those that are in different sizes. It makes his work challenging and, I think, also accessible. There's enough realism in the surrealism that viewers stop to ponder each picture, thinking about meanings but never rejecting the pictures as being meaningless or totally obscure. And for those with some familiarity with the history of art, the reworking of famous images challenges the viewer to place Sam Bak's painting within the larger context of European art, not only with making connections to the Holocaust. And his work, while it's very moving, he doesn't intend that it be horrifying or shocking, not wanting it to be morbid, repellent, transgressive. He also doesn't feel the need to make his work really avant-garde or part of the most contemporary kind of art scenes, some of which you can see even in this room. He doesn't feel compelled to do that because he's been producing so much for so long. Well, his work is often very moving. Now, one will not find in his work things like, say, the Lego concentration camp pieces by Zbigniew Libera, which caused an uproar in the New York Jewish Museum in the mid-1990s. Here you see with someone who decided to, how can we represent the Holocaust? Lego. Kids could buy sets of that, and then kids were supposed to take the little Lego pieces and make, a little model of a ghetto camp. And there were people there in New York who were outraged that why are we saying that kids can have a lot of fun playing with things like that to represent what this displays. And there are also people who felt that the Holocaust and the images of the Holocaust are not, but just be cheap consumers' products. In contrast with Lego, here's a painting from 2001 by Sam, Damage. Another painting containing teddy bear and representing the tragedy of lost childhood. Not just that childhood is something that is fun. In his memoir, Bak wrote, quote, "The incidents in my life, the memories that shuffle themselves in my mind, are neither black nor white. They belong to what Primo Levi called the gray zone," unquote. The gray zone is one of ambiguity, and it's no wonder that Bak says, quote, "My paintings carried no answers, only questions." Questions are ones he asks, not just the Jewish experience of the Holocaust or Jewish traditions and beliefs, but human conditions. Biographies, he feels, interacts with things that are more universal. And though his own life experience infuses his work, he said that, quote, "Paintings are meant to bear personal testimony to the trauma of surviving, not only hearing witness to the trauma of surviving, but searching for meanings in that trauma remains a search." Here, interpretation presents us with a key, both a house key to a home taken from Sam, and maybe a key that can open up books that provide answers to hard questions. I should say that precisely because Sam himself uses his paintings to pose questions to viewers, but not to provide all answers, I always have to resist providing too much of an interpretation of his paintings. Now, let's think a moment about this particular image, a self-portrait. This was 5 by 6 feet in size. And here we see several of his common kinds of themes and images. Here, you get a sense, a little hard for me to shine this here, but here you've got a boy wearing with his arms and so forth in the background. Here's Sam, somebody in a sack like his father put him in to throw him over the wall to survive, but having lost shoes. But something one often sees in many of his paintings in the background, boats, but also chimneys of smoke, suggesting what the Germans did to bodies and other kinds of things. And he sometimes just says, well, you know, is this his good friend Samek or himself? And Samek was a boy who did not survive. He was not saved. And you see, here's the photo from the Warsaw Ghetto when the Jews in Warsaw staged a revolt and the Nazis came in and crushed it, proceeded then to try to kill almost all of the Jews in Warsaw, destroyed the properties and things. But as they were marching a few out, one of the troops took this photograph of this little boy. And Sam has used that at various times, as he did, you see, in that image in this self-portrait. Also on the ground here, in addition to the shoes, are some pieces of paper with drawings, and it's one way of suggesting some of the lost artwork that he had done as a kid that never survived in this self-portrait. And also there's suggestion that maybe a Star of David in here surrounded by sea. Now, this also might suggest with the towers there, an industrial kind of killings has happened at Auschwitz with its crematoria. But sometimes, instead of crematoria with smoke, it's Sabbath candles giving off whiffs of smoke in some of his paintings. This is one of not just of himself, this is a painting he did in 1974. It's 5 by 6 feet of the family. And the figures at the top left, he said, quote, allude perhaps, quote, to his blind great-grandfather and his grandfather, and the ladies in hats perhaps refer to his mother and close friends. And back in the back, behind the canvas is his friend Samak. And here too there are references of columns with smoke. And he admits that some of the figures in this great big picture, particularly the small ones in the back, might be Jews, but they also maybe were soldiers after the 1973 Yom Kippur War who were Jewish soldiers. And he had great affection for his family, but here he paints many of them as blind, unaware of dangers on the horizon. He sometimes uses colors, particularly of red, of fire and blood, and some of these faces reappear in other paintings, though it's usually not absolutely clear where he intends them to really be portraits of his family, or just as faces that he does remember. And he was living in Israel right at the moment that he did this, and was thinking about the losses in both there, but also what could happen in the Arab-Israeli war. He's produced a huge number of interesting works based upon that little image photograph from Warsaw and his understanding of his good friend Samak. Show you a couple of these. You see on the left here, you've got a hollow image and then an image of the boy. Here another one. As I said, he's done a huge variety of these. And this is an interesting study that he once did of that boy. And one way that he was trying to suggest that it was not just Jews who might perish sometime under violence. If he said, if you're a Christian, you might think about the holes in the palm there. In other words, raising the question about the relationship between the sacrifice of Jesus and the sacrifice of boys a couple of millennia later. And show you a few more images from this big series, because they do say some things about Sam. He produced in a year and a half about 75 variations in small oils to great big ones. And then, not entirely satisfied, he produced another 12 large paintings. And they're a lot of variety, and they're quite rich. The Icons of Loss, this was an exhibition done at the Pucker Gallery in Boston. A huge number of things showing the image of the victims. And here you see is one with standing in front of a cross. And very frequently he when he does an image, he has empty shoes. They are reflecting what happened to him and others. Well, you can be relieved. I'm not going to be showing you 100 of these of these images, but there are many that are really quite fascinating. Here you've got a little boy, and the hands are up on the cross. A reminder of what happened if the person is gone. Just an image showing damage. And in this one, image of how many perished. You see, he's got 20 images of that little boy as victims piled up on top of each other. And another thing which often is a reflection of his thinking about where his family and others were killed outside of Vilna is many paintings do have images of destroyed trees, suggesting that that was a disastrous site. And these are the Ponar trees. And one finds elements of this in many of his works of art. When he returned for the first time in 2001 to the city of Vilna, he made an emotional visit to the forest out there where so many had been killed. And hence thinking of tree trunks which have been cut and tumbling off, and thinking of it as a flying away as a disastrous sight. And obviously it's a kind of combination of his images and realism, but also a rather expressionist impression of what that area was like. Now, one sees in many of Sam's paintings not just a portrait of a boy, but a hollow outline, and it's part of his vocabulary, painting absences. And there's many kinds. They can include his family and friends, but sometimes the absence of God, connections to various kinds of themes. This one is a kind of a reference, after all, to Michelangelo, where you've got, you know, in the Sistine Chapel, God reaching out and touching. Well, yeah, a reference to that, but not just reproducing Michelangelo without changing it. Having God and Adam touch fingers, but God is mostly absent here. I've talked to students before in art history, and they recognize are aware of the Michelangelo, but there's many students who've never seen that, and therefore they don't know what to make of this. And I've had to tell them, you know, one asks, what if it's a soldier reaching out to an absent God? What's the message contained in this? In his series, Landscapes of the Jewish Experience, and again, you can see an example of this in the exhibit, Pardes. He did a bunch of paintings entitled that. In Hebrew, apparently it means paradise, or the Garden of Paradise, or perhaps the four approaches to the Garden of Paradise, but he does it as being a place that is really much too complicated. It also sometimes is a suggestion of the covenant tablets of the commandments, which he sometimes does is flat but hollowed out with mostly empty chambers, and a kind of a hard way to imagine someone going into those covenants and what do they mean. That they often show up in his work. And many times he does letters indicating often on tablets, filling a space, sometimes even a grave. He's aware that the commandment, thou shalt not kill, is worth highlighting, but also what it means, but also what it failed to do. It was broken. And so this is a kind of, as it will, metaphor for the broken covenant between God and Jews, interpreted in different directions. And it was a covenant that was violated, of course, also by Christians. In a sense, God has failed to protect all chosen people, left them to suffer horrible deaths. In other words, thou shalt not kill. Well, one could wish that one should, thou shalt not kill, but those key parts of the Bible have not always worked. Sounds of Silence of 1995 adds a broken, shattered world of absences in the ghost of music. Here a string quartet strives to make music in the subtle sight of ruins, and the players are blind or masked or partly whole. Their wings suggest burdened angels. Angels are a frequent theme, Sam wrote. At times, I think this struggle to paint must be similar to Jacob's wrestling with the angel, whether one thinks of the angel as God or as one's undiscovered self. And here in this, some of the limbs are of wood. A body grows from a single die, perhaps suggesting the role of luck and survival or death. And music stands compete for space with the pieces of houses, perhaps houses from Jewish towns from which the musicians came. And the Sounds of Silence, and here's a detailed version of part of it. We know that Jews have been required to perform music in some of the ghettos, and they also composed original music at the Theresienstadt ghetto. And so that has led him here not just listening to music, but perhaps imagining a ghostly void of the music that might have been. And he also produced a series of very moving paintings that dealt with his return to Vilna, and many of them show images of the damage and the destruction of life of a happy Jewish child. Here, the convent in where he had survived and hidden, Vilna angel above it, a temple of learning badly damaged. Here, these were inspired by his first visit back to Vilna. And also from the series of damaged facades, the damage to that city, or a school damaged. And he has painted ruined synagogues, books, tablets here from the ashes. And this one, reconstruction. As you see, these are all variants on his, not just the restored city of Vilna, but trying to think about what had happened to it during the war. And departing is also about leaving Vilna, perhaps about Jews who are forced to leave their home and march through a unhappy street, eventually to become imprisoned. And the people here get sort of transformed into almost ghostly figures surrounded by their civilization. And here are a couple of images of thinking when we're going return to Vilna about how families have been forced to toss out into the streets pottery, dishes, all kinds of things like that, which were ultimately destroyed. And so here he's thinking about what he saw when he was forced to march through there. Many times he also does this. He uses the Star of David, here, Ghetto of Jewish History, done in 1976, where here it's a hollowed out space submerged in slabs of stone. And hints of some of these too are about buildings that are ruined. Another one, which is a Star of David entitled Alone, is a disastrous sight. And this is a close-up of that, showing in the midst of this is a damaged Jewish village here. In other words, the Star of David is not just, you see, a sign, an image or symbol of something that is optimistic. It can also reveal a catastrophe from the past. And it does show some of the melancholy that shows up in many of his works. When I have seen people looking at his work, they're very seldom depressed or mostly traumatized, because his works are so beautifully done that most viewers are attracted to the way in which he's constructed things, the kinds of colors and paintings that he does, and so much variation. That it's one of the good things when I've been in galleries that I haven't seen even some very elderly Jewish survivors not traumatized by looking at this, but grateful to see a variety of images by a survivor, giving them some sense of hope and optimism. Another thing that, and I'll talk about a bit about this, and you'll show you some images, he does a lot what he calls sometimes the fruit of knowledge, pears. He thinks that it was a pear tree and an apple tree in the Garden of Eden, that pears are more soft and luscious than apples, and therefore must have been more tempting to Adam and Eve. And then Adam and Eve learned that this was quite dangerous, and he's produced a big series of paintings about Adam and Eve and their journey to humanity. He recently said, visually the pear makes me think of a pregnant woman. It evokes a feminine womb-like shape. But the sound of the French word père means father, and it reminds Sam that his father saved him by putting him in a sack that looked like pregnancy on his father's back. It saved his life. And the French word sometimes sounds like a Hebrew word, meaning here is a mountain. And so some paintings of mountains that he does resemble pears. They appear in many of his paintings, and lots of friends have made little pear sculptures given to him. here's a version of, another version of Alone. Still Life with Ego. And there's several pairs on display on the wall over here that sometimes are huge with people inside them. Still Life with Ego. Okay. Or he once did this one. He sometimes admits maybe that's a self-portrait of himself in the middle of a pair. And here, once again, is Sam at home, and behind him are just only some of the physical pairs that people have given him, inspired by his works of art. Well, let me conclude by mentioning some very current themes, some of which will be exhibited a week from this Saturday now in the Pucker Gallery. One of them, this one, is entitled From Generation to Generation, and the famous scholar Lawrence Langer has written a very description for the catalog of the exhibit, and it's interesting to read. And here are a couple of paintings of From Generation to Generation. And it's extraordinary. I mean, again, this is a guy who, okay, you know, he's going to do has done 100 like variations on this. And I'm afraid if you go to the Pucker Gallery, you're not going to see all 100 of them. You might be able to see 30 or 40 of different sizes and things. Generation of younger and older people, sometimes confronting each other. And then next fall, there's going to be another exhibit of his work on the theme, which is called From an Eye for an Eye. That is to say, addressing the concept of balanced justice in a whole variety of ways. And my wife and I have been very lucky to be invited to see his progress in his studio on this particular thing. And here's a couple of images photos taken in his studio. Here of the eye for an eye, where paintings are just, some of them are just leaned up against. He hauls them around and works on them. And there are some paintings. And for those of you that are interested in artists, this is only a small number of the brushes that he keeps in his studio, plus a huge variety of little things containing oil colors and stuff like that. He also likes to listen to music, and particularly operas, and he does that sometimes while he's painting, and those are there too. And there he is with these, and just so you happen to know that I was there, enjoying and fascinated by this, but reflected in that mirror. So my final comment is that if you find Sam's work, particularly not just images here, but the ones that you can see over there, I do encourage you, if you ever have the opportunity to go be down in Boston, to go to the Pucker Gallery and tell the people there that you're interested in Sam Bak, because they will pull out things and they take you to a couple of rooms where they have stuff regularly on display. But it can often be the case there, if one said, well, how about, are there any icons of loss or something, that often they will say, okay, hold on a minute, and they may go pull out something. And I've had lots of friends and even some relatives go and do that, not saying that they're going there to spend all of their savings to buy it, but they've gone in saying, oh, someone told us about this wonderful stuff and that I could see it here. May I? And the answer has generally been yes. Now, as I said, he's 83 years old, and we do not know if he's going to live to 110, but he's remarkably healthy and is incredibly productive. At my university, at the art gallery, when talking to somebody and they were saying he does that much, I had one of our art teachers said, oh, it's impossible to do 100 huge oils in a single year. Kidding, no. It's not. He suggests a theme to the Pucker Gallery, and they agree, and the Pucker Gallery might say, okay, we can put one of these up in 10 months from now. And Sam will say, okay. And every single day from like 7 in the morning until mid-afternoon, 7 days a week, unless he has to travel somewhere, he's in his gallery producing the kinds of things that you can see. So, thanks very much.